People came to California to build up their lives, to build their families, to move forward, reinvent themselves. That's becoming harder and harder. The regulatory environment, I mean, that's why we keep losing companies. The rate of companies leaving has doubled in the last year. What business people say to me is, it's not what's already passed, it's what might pass next year. The state is kind of out of control, and a lot of people figure the best thing to do is leave. Who knows what crazy stuff is going to happen?
Hey everybody, I'm Cabot Phillips with the Daily Wire. We are joined today by a very special guest, Mr. Joel Kotkin. Joel is the author of The Coming of Neo-Feudalism and a presidential fellow in urban futures at Chapman University. Joel, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So Joel, you've been covering growing demographic trends in the United States for decades now. You've been digging into the data, looking at studies, analyzing kind of what America is starting to look like and what's going on from state to state, community to community, minority versus other populations in America. And you have some really interesting insight on this. So I want to first start on California. This is what we've been talking about. Everyone in the news is talking about kind of the growing trends we're seeing there of people fleeing the state. What do you make of that trend? And kind of we can get into the reasons for it, but as a brief overview, what do you see going on in California?
Well, okay. Now, of course, I've been here about 50 years now. So seen a lot of changes. And I think fundamentally several things have been happening. Historically, California relied on the import of talent from other parts of the world and from the other parts of the country. About 10 years ago, the flow into California, or even 20 years ago, the flow from the rest of the country went negative. What's interesting is that flow has changed as you look at the IRS data, which is really the best data on the specifics. It's become more middle-aged and a little more affluent. At the beginning, a lot of the people leaving were sort of at the lower end of the economic spectrum, tended to be older. Now we're seeing a big increase in 35 to 54, income of about 100,000. So that's a big change, and the numbers have gotten much bigger. You know, I get such a kick out of the media cadre, which will go and say, well, there's no exodus. Well, I don't know. Seems to me, you know, losing in 15 years, 2.7 million people net seems to me to be a bit of a problem. But, you know, who am I to say? Then the more, in a sense, what's really interesting and ironic is minorities are also leaving the state. What's even more surprising has been the movement of the foreign-born. Los Angeles is now losing foreign-born population. The Bay Area is pretty stagnant. Meanwhile, foreign-born population in places like Dallas is going through the roof, up 30% in a decade. We are a state that used to be the state of the young. Now we're aging 50% faster than the rest of the country. So even though we have this trajectory from the children of the immigrants that is still prominent, what you really are seeing is is that families are leaving, people aren't having kids. You know, LA and San Francisco have among about the lowest fertility rates of any regions in the country. This was a place people came to. This is what I find so tragic. People came to California to build up their lives, to build their families, to buy a house, to move forward, reinvent themselves. That's becoming harder and harder.
We saw the census data come out. California, the only state to lose 2 congressional representatives in the country due to slower rate of population growth. Can you walk us through a little bit more of that, of who's leaving and what kind of numbers we're seeing?
Well, basically what we're seeing, you know, certainly now going well over 150 to 200,000 annually net. You know, and of course, what people will say is, oh, well, but it's a state of 35 million people. Therefore, you know, this is a small group, but if it happens every year, they're real numbers, they're real people. And what's most disturbing to me is the people who are not coming. I think that may be the most important thing. There was no sense in the past that California was someplace where you had to have really great credentials, and you had to work for a specific number of people, or you came from a wealthy family. That was sort of what you have today. In those days, anybody could come, and you could be somebody who came from Mexico and started working in a machine shop, and then maybe eventually you started your own machine shop, or you made a good living. That path to upward mobility is gone, and there's a really devastating study about this that just came out from the Breakthrough Institute, which is a environmental group, called The Green Jim Crow. And the author, Jennifer Hernandez, just talks about, she grew up in a working class steel worker family in the Bay Area, who bought a house, moved into the middle class, even though they had originally been farm workers. That story is becoming rarer and rarer. If I had the same ambitions I had back in the 70s, I'd probably move to Texas.
So I want to get to why people are leaving specifically. And when you spend a lot of time in the data looking at the numbers, what are the main reasons people cite for leaving the state?
The biggest reason seems to be housing costs. That seems to be the big driver. I think for some more conservative people, it may just be the complete political environment is difficult. Taxes are an issue, obviously. But I would say, the regulatory environment, I mean, that's why we keep losing companies. I mean, and there's a new study out that shows that the rate of companies leaving has doubled in the last year. How does anyone suspect that a company or a person is going to want to move and work in downtown LA, which is a gigantic homeless encampment? I don't see how that works. So I think and lastly, there's this problem with education. We have a terrible education system, and now we have to battle the wokest attempt to make it so that there isn't even any concept of merit. They want to reduce or eliminate some of the advanced classes. I mean, if you're a parent who has aspirations for your kid, this is not such a good place to be. And a lot of people figure the best thing to do is leave. Lastly, and this is what I hear, particularly from more affluent people, fear of a wealth tax being imposed here in California, so that the state will start going after your assets. There's considerable concern about that. And so, what business people say to me is, it's not what's already passed, it's what might pass next year.
You talk about the businesses that are leaving, and when you look at the list, I mean, it's pretty striking, even just off the list here. Elon Musk and SpaceX starting to move, Larry Ellison and Oracle, Apple, Dropbox, Charles Schwab, even people like Joe Rogan, us at the Daily Wire, we left Los Angeles. So you talk about the reasons that we're seeing this, but what caused those underlying conditions? You talk about the spike in housing costs and the increased congestion for traffic, and you talk about the increased homelessness and things like that. What caused those underlying conditions that are driving people out?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the regulatory regime that we have, which is, made it impossible or almost impossible to build affordable single-family houses in the periphery, because the state has decided that everyone should live in density and ride the bus to work, even though very few people do. We're going to shrink the number of roads. We're actually going to make it worse. The goal being, we are going to make traffic so horrible that you'll have to take transit. I mean, literally, we have rulers who want to make our lives more miserable, and they're doing a good job. The state is simply not interested in the private sector outside of Hollywood and the tech oligarchs. They have no particular interest in your basic industry. So what you've seen is, like, for instance, because you have very high energy costs in particular and very tough regulation, companies in the industrial field, in construction, in energy, all have to leave. And those were good blue collar jobs, a lot of times union jobs. I'm not a conservative. I'm an old fashioned social democrat. I loved what Pat Brown brought to California. That legacy, that great legacy that he left of the great education system, good roads, lots of good high paying jobs, many of them union. That world is being destroyed, and it's being destroyed by Pat Brown's own inheritors. It's kind of tragic.
When did other businesses start to kind of feel left out by the government? And when did other private sector industries start to look around and say, well, wait a second, tech and entertainment are getting all these benefits and getting, preferential treatment. We're not going to stick around for this. When did you see that trend begin?
It's been developing for a long time, but it got much, much worse with the climate change movement and the decision by our leadership. We decided we're going to be the center of everything. So we're going to ban nuclear power. We're going to ban natural gas. We're going to go all renewable, which of course is pretty much impossible without incredibly high prices. You got this jihad going on, this climate jihad, and that I think has really pushed things over. So we always had a strong and I would say defensible to some extent green policy. I think there are many things that we did right here in California, but it just got crazy.
So if you're a business in California, tangibly speaking, what kind of regulations could you expect to see with regard to the climate initiatives you talked about earlier? I think when a lot of people outside of California hear that, they may not know what that actually looks like at a granular level. What sorts of things does a business owner expect under that?
Okay, I think there are several different things. One is you're going to have high energy costs. So that's going to particularly hit industrial producers. Like I remember having an interview with the head of California Steel, which is still here and out in the Inland Empire. But he says we could never expand here. We're talking about energy costs 2-3 times what they would be somewhere else. But I also think that you're going to find that as a result of state policy, very hard to locate in the interior, very hard to build housing where it's affordable, so that what you end up with is your workforce unable to afford housing remotely close. Then they're stuck on long commutes, ironically very bad for the environment, but that's the result of the policy. We may find it very difficult to work as contractors. This is an economy that's evolved in large part towards a lot of contract workers. That's also threatened. Labor laws are very tough. If you own a building, there's legislation to allow squatters to stay in buildings. There's a proposal to tax extra taxes on unoccupied buildings. I mean, frankly, you just never quite know what's coming next.
So Texas is one of the things that we've been tracking, kind of the growth of the state there, and people are starting to call it the new California, or at least what California was in decades past. What do you make of the transition of businesses and people to Texas? Why do you think that's happening? Why Texas specifically?
Well, I think Texas is a lot of things. One, obviously, they have critical mass in their skills. In other words, you've got a lot of skilled people living there. They seem to be able to absorb growth without extraordinarily high housing costs, because I think of the way things are regulated or not regulated in Texas. You can build in the periphery. Austin is beginning to get a little bit on the bubble side, but basically you could buy in, let's say, North Dallas with a good area with good schools. You can buy a house for $500,000 in a good school district, a significantly large house, 2,500, 3,000 square feet. That same house anywhere remotely close to major job centers in California, it's going to cost you at least twice as much. I mean, I'm seeing houses in Culver City go for $2 million. I mean, I'm not talking about mansions. I'm talking about very modest houses. So, fundamentally, people can achieve a middle-class quality of life much better in Texas. There's a two-party system, so particularly on the local level. So you get some sort of pushback on the policy side that maybe moves to more reasonable solutions. And I think you also have a structural problem, which is California. The public employee unions are incredibly powerful. We can see that in the school shutdowns. We see it in the enormous pensions. And so, living in California means absorbing an enormous amount of long-term debt. So even if we raise taxes and we spend more money, much of it doesn't even go to things that actually improve the quality of life, they go into pensions and increasingly into transfer payments.
And so, do you see any specific trends politically speaking on who's leaving? You touched a little bit earlier. You said some people leave because of the fact that they don't like that there is an overwhelming Democrat majority in the state legislature in California. Do you see any trends of who is leaving politically speaking? Is it down the line? Is it more Republicans? Is it more Democrats?
That's a huge debate. People in some of the red states are worried that the flow of Californians will move them towards greater lunacy, and that's entirely possible. But I think it's a mixed picture. I think many of the people leaving may be fairly conservative. Some of them may be liberal. What I do think is it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans if young families continue to leave, because those are going to tend to be concerned about issues like education and housing, and they are leaving, and that will probably hurt the Republicans in the long run. We've passed an insane law here in California where for under $1,000 stealing is essentially you get a ticket, which of course those people won't pay anyway. So if I own a small liquor store in Anaheim, I have to watch there while some person goes and takes $1,000 worth of stuff. Now, some big companies like Walgreens is shutting down stores in San Francisco because of this kind of pilferage. The oligarchs send their kids to private schools, or they go to the most elite suburban schools. They don't have to worry about densification because they live on estates and they can buy the properties around them. They don't have to worry about crime because I'm sure in Los Altos Hills, crime is not a big issue. It's a big issue in more middle-class neighborhoods. So essentially what we have a breakdown of upward mobility that affects minorities in particular. And so what we're finding, and this is what the Breakthrough report talks about, California is becoming more segregated. And by the way, the place that's segregating in many ways the most radically is the epicenter of our progressive culture, the Bay Area.
And so I want to get to the trend as you see it, the way it's going now, what it's going to take to stop it, if there is anything that can stop it at this point. And so do you see this trend of people leaving the state happening anytime soon? You mentioned people being fed up. Are they fed up enough to stop leaving? So where do you see this going? And essentially, is it too late?
I think if there's enough pushback, I think there can be some moderation. I'm working right now on a report in part for what's left of moderate Democrats in the legislature about trying to instruct them that these anti-business policies are terrible for their own constituents. For the working class guy who lives in Riverside and is a construction worker and has to go into drive to Long Beach, on the 91 freeway every day in his F-150, that person is screwed by high energy prices. I think there's pushback. I think that there's, frankly, if the Republicans had a strong person who could appeal to those constituencies, I think that they could conceivably win. I don't think the game is over yet. And I think, oddly enough, the rise of Asian and Latino voters may be the decisive shift.
And so in closing, for a concise answer from you, what would be, if you were advising Governor Newsom or advising any other state officials, what would be the 2 or 3 things that you would say they need to tackle first if they're going to once again be just this beacon for America, for people to come to want to bring their businesses? And what should they be doing to get people to stop leaving? What would be the first few things that you would try and tackle?
One, I would revise the climate policy, not to get rid of the goals so much as to how you get about them. In other words, maybe you can get some of your goals by increasing people working at home or having satellite offices where people live. So that would be one. The second thing I would really look at is you've got to redo the education system. We are not training our kids for jobs that they could possibly take. Education is a big factor. Obviously, we need to change the housing policy to allow more construction in areas that are affordable. And I think in terms of taxes, we should be looking at how to move away from high income taxes, perhaps looking at how to reform some of the property taxes, but at the same time, reducing the income tax. Low property taxes helps people like me, older people who own their own home. High income taxes are a huge problem for young families coming to move here. When you're paying 13, 14% of your income in taxes, in state taxes, and then you're paying all the federal taxes, it's very ruinous. So what I would ultimately do is try to say, what is it going to do to retain and attract talented, motivated, entrepreneurial, younger people to California?
Fascinating stuff, Joel. We really appreciate your time and your expertise on this issue. Can you let our viewers know where they can find more about you and your book and anything else that they might want to learn?
Sure. The book is and it talks a lot about California, is The Coming of Neo-Feudalism. That's from Encounter Books. You can get it on Amazon or our local bookstore. The best way of reaching me or staying in touch with me is my website, joelkotkin.com, not hard to remember. I have all my articles are on our website, www.newgeography.com.
Awesome. Well, Joel, we really appreciate your time again. Thank you so much for the insight into what's going on in California, what the trends are that you're seeing, and we appreciate it again. I'm Cabot Phillips with the Daily Wire with Joel Kotkin. Thanks for tuning in.